Queen Liz humbly welcomes you to this video on Phillis Wheatley Foundational Mother, Humanity on Trial. African-American poet born around 1753, she became a genius in bondage and the first African-American author to publish a book of poetry. Before we dive into this powerful story of fight, faith, and fortitude, Queen Liz requests that you please make sure to watch until the very end. Also, if you find value in this story, hit the like button, leave a comment, and help us hype this video. It costs you nothing, but it truly helps push this message and support the growth of this channel. Now let's begin. Phillis Wheatley Foundational Mother, Humanity on Trial. The life of Phillis Wheatley was a series of triumphs over impossible odds, yet it concluded in a tragic struggle to preserve her intellectual legacy. Her correspondence with George Washington remains one of the most remarkable dialogues of the Revolutionary era. In October 1775, while Washington was stationed at the Continental Army headquarters in Cambridge, Wheatley sent him a poem titled, "To His Excellency, George Washington." The verse was filled with high-toned neoclassical imagery, famously referring to the American cause as Columbia, and characterizing Washington as a leader of virtue on thy side. At age 7, the girl who would be named Phillis was violently uprooted from the Senegambia region, a vibrant cultural landscape where she likely spoke the Wolof language. The kidnapping was a total sensory and familial erasure. In an instant, she was stripped of her name, her kinship ties, and the linguistic framework of her world. Yet, deep within the trauma of the Middle Passage, she carried a singular, crystalline memory that the shackles could not reach. The image of her mother performing a daily libation, pouring out water before the rising sun. This ritual, a traditional West African act of reverence and connection to the divine, became the last thread connecting her to her African self. As she grew up in the Wheatley household, this solitary memory functioned as a hidden spiritual compass, while her captors worked to fill her mind with Western theology and Latin verse. That image of the morning water remained an unspoken testament to a world that existed before her enslavement. It was a fragment of a lost identity that signaled her life had not begun in a Boston slave market. By holding onto this ritual of light and water, Wheatley maintained a private, ancestral sanctuary that no perpetual trial or Enlightenment critic could ever fully penetrate or explain away. The arrival of the young girl who would become Phillis Wheatley was marked by a fragile tenacity that defied the grim expectations of the Boston slave market. On July 11, 1761, she emerged from the hold of the slaver Phillis after surviving the brutal Middle Passage, a journey that had claimed the lives of countless others. She was described by onlookers as a slender, frail child, nearly naked, and wrapped in a piece of dirty carpet. Her physical state was so diminished that she was sold for a trifle to Susanna Wheatley, as many prospective buyers believed she was terminally ill and would not survive the coming winter. This initial valuation of her life, measured in the cold terms of a risky investment, stands in stark contrast to the intellectual giant she would become. The merchant John Wheatley purchased her not for labor, but as a domestic servant intended to be trained as a companion for his wife. At the time of her sale, her survival was considered a near impossibility. Yet, within 16 months of this trifling transaction, the child who was expected to perish had mastered the English language and was beginning to outpace the most educated minds in Boston. Her entry into the American narrative was a transition from being a body destined for an unmarked grave to a voice that would eventually command the attention of the Western world. The Wheatleys' purchase of the young girl in 1761 was an act of profound erasure that began at the water's edge. Her African birth name was stripped away, replaced by Phillis, the name of the very slave ship that had carried her through the horrors of the Middle Passage. By tethering her identity to a vessel of commerce and the Wheatley surname, her captors attempted to reset her history as starting only upon her arrival in Boston. Although she was spared the brutal field labor common in the South and given a rare education, she existed in a state of suspended humanity. To the Wheatleys and their social circle, she was a prodigy to be showcased, an exotic curiosity whose intellectual feats were treated as a domesticated marvel rather than an inherent right. This paradox defined her existence. She was literate enough to translate the classics but legally classified as chattel. Even as she sat in the Wheatley parlor reading the Bible and Latin verse, she remained a piece of property that could be bought, sold, or bequeathed. This relatively humane treatment was a gilded cage that masked the underlying violence of her status. Her brilliance was frequently used by her owners to burnish their own reputation for benevolence, turning her mind into a luxury commodity. It was only through her writing that she began to reclaim the self that had been buried under the names of a ship and a master, forging a new identity that the law of the time was yet unwilling to recognize. The interrogation in 1772 served as the ultimate threshold for Wheatley's entry into the Western canon. This perpetual trial was not a mere literary review, but a legal and philosophical inquisition held in a stark Boston room. 18 of the colony's most powerful men, the very architects of the American Revolution, sat as judges over a teenager's mind. They grilled her on the complexities of Virgil, the nuances of Latin translation, and the theological depth of the Bible, searching for any sign that she was merely a mimic of white thought. When she passed with flying colors, she achieved a victory that was both personal and political. By forcing these men to sign their names to an attestation, Wheatley secured a document that functioned as a passport into the world of the human. This piece of paper, later printed in her book, stood as a silent witness against the racism of the age. It was a grudging admission from the colonial elite that the genius they claimed for themselves could exist within the soul of an African woman. This moment transformed her from a domestic servant into a disruptive intellectual force, ensuring that when her voice reached the public, it did so with a seal of authenticity that no one could legally deny, even if they spent the next century trying to ignore it. Her triumph in that room was the first major blow to the Enlightenment's racial hierarchy. By proving she could master the very classics used to justify her exclusion, Wheatley didn't just earn the right to publish. She forced a recalibration of what it meant to be an American intellectual. The 18 men who signed that document, figures like John Hancock and Andrew Oliver, became inadvertent witnesses to a revolution that preceded the one in 1776, the revolution of the black mind reclaiming its place in history. The interrogation in 1772 served as the ultimate threshold for Wheatley's entry into the Western canon. This perpetual trial was not a mere literary review, but a legal and philosophical inquisition held in a stark Boston room. 18 of the colony's most powerful men, the very architects of the American Revolution, sat as judges over a teenager's mind. They grilled her on the complexities of Virgil, the nuances of Latin translation, and the theological depth of the Bible, searching for any sign that she was merely a mimic of white thought. When she passed with flying colors, she achieved a victory that was both personal and political. By forcing these men to sign their names to an attestation, Wheatley secured a document that functioned as a passport into the world of the human. This piece of paper, later printed in her book, stood as a silent witness against the racism of the age. It was a grudging admission from the colonial elite that the genius they claimed for themselves could exist within the soul of an African woman. This moment transformed her from a domestic servant into a disruptive intellectual force, ensuring that when her voice reached the public, it did so with a seal of authenticity that no one could legally deny, even if they spent the next century trying to ignore it. Rejected by Boston publishers due to her race, Phillis traveled to London in 1773 to seek a publisher. Sponsored by wealthy abolitionists, she received a royal reception and became the most famous African of her time. Washington, despite being a slaveholder, was so moved by her tribute that he responded on February 2, 1776, addressing her with the profound respect of Miss Phillis. He apologized for his delayed reply, citing the weight of business, and praised her poetic talents and elegant lines. Most significantly, he invited her to visit his camp, an invitation she reportedly accepted in March 1776, marking a rare moment in history where an enslaved, or recently freed, black woman was received with honor by the commander-in-chief. Wheatley's verse acted as a Trojan horse of subversion. She used a Christian mask to appeal to her audience while subtly placing Christians and Africans on the same spiritual plane. She asserted that if black souls could join the angelic train, the moral foundation of slavery was illegitimate. However, as the war dragged on, Wheatley's focus shifted toward securing her own future through a second book of poetry. Historical records, specifically advertisements placed in the Boston Evening Post and General Advertiser in 1779, reveal her desperate attempt to find, quote, subscribers for a projected volume dedicated to the Right Honorable Benjamin Franklin. This proposed book was significantly more ambitious than her first, intended to be a 300-page collection of 33 poems and 13 letters. Following the book's publication and Susanna Wheatley's death, Phillis was emancipated. She married free black grocer John Peters in 1778. The couple faced severe financial hardship, and tragically, all their children died in early childhood. The tragedy of the lost manuscript remains one of the greatest mysteries in American literature. After her death in 1784, her husband John Peters, who was fleeing creditors and legal battles, reportedly took the trunk containing her unpublished works. Whether the manuscript was sold for scraps, seized by creditors, or simply lost in the transient life Peters led remains unknown. Some historians speculate that the poems were sold to pay off debts, while others believe they were destroyed. The loss is profound. While her first book was published under the scrutiny of white attesters, the second volume would have represented the unfiltered voice of an emancipated woman. To this day, scholars search archival basements and private collections, hoping that the 300 pages of Wheatley's mature genius might one day resurface and rewrite our understanding of the black experience during the birth of the United States. The battle for her legacy spans centuries. In the 1700s and 1800s, abolitionists championed her work as proof of black humanity. From the 1920s to the 1960s, critics like Richard Wright dismissed her. Since 1973, black feminists have reclaimed her as a strategic, brilliant foremother. The 1973 resurrection at Jackson State, organized by poet Margaret Walker, brought together prominent black women writers. They collectively rejected criticisms and reclaimed Wheatley as a pioneer of liberation, paving the way for those who followed. Phillis Wheatley is the mother of African American literature. She was a pioneer who used Enlightenment reason to expose slavery's unreason. Her legacy is a testament to the transformative power of literature and the indomitable nature of the human spirit. Part 2 of this video examines the perpetual trial of Phillis Wheatley, focusing on her strategic brilliance and the forging of a literary tradition. We dive into the 1772 interrogation, where she defended her intellect against Boston's elite, a moment that defined the black authorial voice. Beyond the trial, we explore her sophisticated use of subversive piety to critique slavery from within the belly of the beast. By analyzing her lost manuscripts and her bold correspondence with George Washington, we reveal how Wheatley didn't just survive her era, she engineered a blueprint for African American resistance and poetic excellence. This intellectual blockade turned Wheatley's 1772 examination into a high-stakes trial of the soul. The panel of 18 estimable men, representing the peak of colonial authority, acted as an inquisitorial board to determine if an African girl could possess the reason defined by Enlightenment standards. Their signatures on her book's attestation were not merely a verification of authorship. They were a grudging admission that she had breached the wall of their racial hierarchy. By forcing their recognition, Wheatley utilized her poetry as a weapon of philosophical disruption. She mastered the high classical style they revered, using their own cultural language to dismantle the claim of her inferiority. This was the strategic heart of her brilliance. She didn't just produce literature, she performed an act of radical humanity. Her success exposed the fundamental flaw in the Enlightenment's logic, proving that the capacity for genius was not a racial privilege, but a universal human trait. This intellectual blockade turned Wheatley's 1772 examination into a high-stakes trial of the soul. The panel of 18 estimable men, representing the peak of colonial authority, acted as an inquisitorial board to determine if an African girl could possess the reason defined by Enlightenment standards. Their signatures on her book's attestation were not merely a verification of authorship. They were a grudging admission that she had breached the wall of their racial hierarchy. By forcing their recognition, Phillis Wheatley utilized her poetry as a weapon of philosophical disruption. She mastered the high classical style they revered, using their own cultural language to dismantle the claim of her inferiority. This was the strategic heart of her brilliance. She didn't just produce literature, she performed an act of radical humanity. Her success exposed the fundamental flaw in the Enlightenment's logic, proving that the capacity for genius was not a racial privilege, but a universal human trait. One of the most potent examples of this strategic brilliance is found in her poem addressed to the Earl of Dartmouth. In these lines, she explicitly connects her personal trauma of enslavement to the broader American struggle for liberty, forcing her readers to confront the hypocrisy of their own tyrannic sway. Wheatley wrote, "Should you, my lord, while you peruse my song, wonder from whence my love of freedom sprung, whence flow these wishes for the common good, by feeling hearts alone best understood. I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate was snatched from Afric's fancied happy seat. Such my case, and can I then but pray, others may never feel tyrannic sway." In 1772, the Boston Authentication Panel, a group of 18 high-ranking men, including prominent slaveholders like John Hancock and Governor Thomas Hutchinson, convened to test her authorship. They subjected Wheatley to a rigorous interrogation, searching for any sign of intellectual fraud. Though she passed this trial of the soul, proving her genius was undeniable, the prejudice of the colonies remained unyielding. No American publisher would dare print her manuscript. This racist blockade forced Wheatley to look across the Atlantic for validation. In London, her work finally found a champion in the Countess of Huntingdon, leading to the 1773 publication of poems on various subjects, religious and moral. The book's success transformed her into an international icon and exposed the deep hypocrisy of a burgeoning America. While colonial leaders clamored for liberty from British rule, they simultaneously sought to silence the most brilliant voice in their midst. By securing a global audience, Wheatley bypassed their censorship, ensuring her poetic legacy would survive as a permanent testament to Black humanity and the universal right to be heard. Wheatley acted as the architect of her own public relations, utilizing dedications to strategically align herself with powerful figures like the Countess of Huntingdon, Benjamin Franklin, and George Washington. She understood that in a world designed to silence her, proximity to power was a form of protection. By dedicating her 1773 volume to the Countess, she secured the social shield of British nobility, which effectively forced the hand of American skeptics. Her outreach to Washington was equally calculated. By praising the general in his own heroic language, she elevated her status from an enslaved domestic servant to a patriotic muse of the Revolution. When she met Benjamin Franklin in London, she leveraged the encounter to solidify her standing within the transatlantic intellectual elite. This wasn't merely social climbing, it was a masterful survival strategy. Through these high-level alliances, Wheatley ensured that her voice would be heard by the very men shaping the New World, forcing them to acknowledge her humanity through the undeniable brilliance of her pen. In 1773, Wheatley's poems on various subjects, religious and moral, was published in London. The first book by an African American, it was a pivotal act of literature. In the following excerpt, "Some view our sable race with scornful eye, their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, blacks as Cain, may be refined, and join the angelic train." Wheatley's surface reading was pious, grateful for Christian education, apologetic for her pagan land. However, the subversive reading was a deliberate syntactic ambiguity. Is she addressing Christians and Negroes? Or is she equating them, highlighting the hypocrisy of white enslavers who claim spiritual superiority while committing diabolical acts? An economic pun referencing the refining of sugar, the bloody commodity of the slave trade. Through her verse, Wheatley subversively challenged slavery. For instance, in On Being Brought from Africa to America, she asserts that Africans can be refined and join the angelic train, arguing against the moral basis of enslavement. This was a sophisticated linguistic trap. By adopting the religious language of her captors, she used their own theology to dismantle their racial hierarchy. When she wrote, "Remember Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, / may be refined, and join th angelic train," she was issuing a direct moral challenge to white society. She cleverly placed the word Christians in a position of scrutiny, reminding them that if they truly believed in the universal salvation of the soul, they could not logically justify the perpetual bondage of those same souls. Wheatley transformed the poem from a simple narrative of conversion into a searing critique of colonial hypocrisy. She essentially argued that if black people were capable of reaching the same spiritual heights as white men, then the earthly institutions of slavery were not only cruel, but a violation of divine law. This subversive piety allowed her to speak truths that would have been censored had they been expressed in more direct, secular terms. She used a strategic mask of piety to criticize American hypocrisy. In To the Right Honorable William, Earl of Dartmouth, she speaks of her flight from tyranny, a subtle condemnation of her own enslavement. By framing her personal kidnapping as a seeming cruel fate that snatched her from Afric's fancied happy seat, she did more than recount a biography. She humanized the abstract concept of liberty. Wheatley masterfully redirected the Earl's attention from the political grievances of white colonists to the visceral, physical theft of a child from a father's panting breast. This wasn't just poetry. It was a calculated rhetorical ambush. She adopted the neoclassical style of her oppressors to prove her mastery of their culture, then used that very mastery to expose the moral rot at the center of their society. By equating her own longing for freedom with the colonists' struggle against Britain, she made it impossible for a feeling heart to support the latter while ignoring the former. Her verse acted as a mirror, forcing the revolutionary generation to see that their tyrannic sway over black bodies was the ultimate betrayal of the very Enlightenment values they claimed to champion. The literary lineage of the Black experience began with Phillis Wheatley's 1773 To S.M., A Young African Painter, a poem that functioned as a radical act of recognition. By addressing Scipio Moorhead, a fellow enslaved artist, Wheatley bypassed the white gaze to create the first recorded instance of Black creative solidarity in America. She spoke of a laboring bosom and a nobler strain, envisioning a future where their shared genius would be immortalized beyond the reach of tyrannic sway. This moment established a foundational, matriarchal tradition, proving that Black art could exist for its own sake, rooted in a shared intellectual soul rather than white validation. A century and a half later, Langston Hughes picked up this mantle during the Harlem Renaissance, though the landscape of his resistance had shifted. While Wheatley had to master the rigid, neoclassical heroic couplets of her captors to prove her humanity, Hughes intentionally broke those forms. In his seminal 1921 poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, he reclaimed the benighted Africa Wheatley had been taught to mourn, instead painting it as the ancient, golden cradle of the human soul. Where Wheatley looked to a heavenly splendid city for ultimate liberation from her creaturely status, Hughes found the liberation in the mud of the Mississippi and the rhythms of the blues. The connection between them is a narrative of evolving reclamation. Wheatley was the architect who survived the perpetual trial by proving her reason through the master's language. Hughes was the builder who used that hard-won ground to celebrate a specifically Black aesthetic. Both poets centered their work on the deep intent of the Black heart, transforming the pain of exclusion into a literary legacy. Together they represent the transition from a voice begging for recognition to a voice that unapologetically asserts its own ancient and enduring power. Thomas Jefferson became the architect of a psychological prison for Wheatley's legacy when he wrote in Notes on the State of Virginia that religion indeed has produced a Phillis Wheatley, but it could not produce a poet. By dismissing her work as mere imitation or below the dignity of criticism, Jefferson initiated a campaign of intellectual denial that would haunt American letters for centuries. He wasn't just critiquing the book, he was attempting to legislate the Black soul out of the realm of high art. This perpetual trial meant that for generations, Wheatley was forced to stand in the prisoner's dock of history, her worth measured not by her meter but by her race. This dismissal created a recurring pattern in American criticism, where Black creative capacity was treated as a curiosity rather than a contribution. Even as she was celebrated by abolitionists, her work was often infantilized or stripped of its political teeth. The tragedy of this intellectual denial is that it forced subsequent Black writers to spend their energy proving they were human before they could be artists. Wheatley's struggle thus became the blueprint for the African-American literary tradition, a tradition born out of a constant need to dismantle the lies told by men of power. Her legacy is not just the poems she left behind, but the very fact that she survived a system designed to ensure her silence, forcing the world to acknowledge the divine gift that Jefferson tried so desperately to ignore. While Jefferson attempted to define her out of existence, a counter-chorus of Enlightenment giants recognized Wheatley as a peer in the Republic of Letters. Voltaire, the preeminent philosopher of the French Enlightenment, used Wheatley as a weapon against racial dogma, writing in 1774 that her work was very good English verse and served as living proof that black people could master the highest forms of European culture. In the American colonies, John Adams privately acknowledged her genius, while George Washington's public deference to her great poetical talents provided a military and moral endorsement that Jefferson's cynicism could not erase. These figures didn't just praise her, they utilized her existence to challenge the very orthodoxy of inferiority that Jefferson championed. To them, Wheatley was a philosophical phenomenon, a living contradiction to the claim that reason was the exclusive domain of the white man. Their recognition created a historical friction that kept her legacy alive even when American institutions tried to bury it. By securing the admiration of the men who designed the modern world, Wheatley ensured that her perpetual trial would always have witnesses for the defense. She became a landmark in the history of human rights, a woman whose pen forced the architects of liberty to see the reflection of their own ideals in the eyes of a former slave. The legacy of Phillis Wheatley is not merely a historical footnote, but a profound call to action, an invitation to acknowledge her as the first foundational American author to wield literature as a weapon of liberation. Her life was a sustained act of intellectual resistance, a quiet war fought with ink and meter against a global system designed to ensure her silence. By mastering the high classical language of her captors and repurposing it to articulate a love of freedom, she built a literary bridge between the deep traumas of the Middle Passage and the lofty ideals of the American Revolution. She forced a nation to see that the desire for liberty was not a white privilege, but a universal human heartbeat. Her enduring legacy demands a final rejection of the intellectual denial sparked by skeptics like Thomas Jefferson. It insists that we recognize black creative genius as the very bedrock of the American canon, rather than a marginal curiosity. Today, Wheatley stands as the founding mother of a literary tradition that spans centuries, from the slave narratives of the 1800s to the modern heights of the Nobel Prize. She remains a pioneer who ensured that even under the weight of unimaginable oppression, the black voice would not only survive but soar, creating a blueprint for every generation that has since used the written word to demand their stolen humanity back. The surviving letters from Wheatley's final years offer a heartbreaking yet defiant window into her evolution, from a celebrated prodigy to a woman battling for survival in a crumbling economy. By 1778, after the deaths of her primary protectors, John and Susanna Wheatley, her correspondence took on a more pragmatic and weary tone. She was no longer just the African muse writing for the elite. She was an emancipated woman navigating the brutal reality of being black, female, and poor in a post-revolutionary society. In her late letters to her lifelong friend, Obor Tanner, a fellow enslaved woman living in Newport, the neoclassical flourishes of her youth were replaced by a raw, spiritual intimacy. They discussed the heavy trials of their lives, finding solace in a shared faith that transcended their earthly hardships. These final writings reveal a woman who remained intellectually ambitious despite her deteriorating circumstances. Her 1779 advertisements for a second volume of poetry, which promised a 300-page collection of poems and letters, showed that she still viewed herself as a public intellectual with a vital message for the new republic. Even as she was forced into domestic labor that broke her health, her letters suggest she never abandoned the love of freedom she had once championed. She continued to correspond with figures like Benjamin Franklin, attempting to leverage her past fame to secure a future for her family. Ultimately, these fragments represent a lost Wheatley, one who was moving toward a more mature, perhaps more radical voice that we only glimpse through the shadows of her struggle. The tragedy of her final year is not just her death in poverty, but the silence that followed. When she died on December 5, 1784, she left behind a legacy that was both a triumph of the human spirit and a searing indictment of a nation that could celebrate her genius while allowing her to perish in a cold boarding house. Her final letters remain a testament to a voice that refused to be extinguished, even as the world around her went dark. This video concludes by reiterating her status as the foundational mother of African American literature and the enduring power of her strategic brilliance. If you liked this video and would like more content like this, please like, comment, and hype this and other Queen Liz videos. Also subscribe to the YouTube channel. It is free for you, and Queen Liz would be ever so grateful.